Spain once gripped the world in its palm. In the 16th century, it wasn't Britain that presided over the planet's largest empire. It was Spain. For the first time in human history, one monarchy oversaw a network of territories that stretched across continents, from Europe down into Africa, across vast parts of the Americas, and across the oceans, all the way into Asia. The reach was so enormous that people began saying, "The sun never sets on the Spanish Empire," a line the British would later recycle for themselves. But here's the contradiction at the heart of that story. The wealthiest empire the world had ever seen was slowly destroyed by the very treasure that made it powerful. And that matters now because the pattern hasn't gone away. Like Spain, people still confuse a sudden flood of money for real strength, and the collapse that follows that illusion is always severe. When Spain entered the Americas after 1492, it stumbled into what looked like limitless fortune, gold and silver, in amounts that no European crown had ever imagined were even possible, were seized in staggering quantities. The conquest of Mexico in 1521 shattered the Aztec Empire and handed Spain access to incredibly rich mines in Zacatecas. Around 10 years later, the fall of the Inca Empire in Peru opened up Potosi, a mountain of silver so immense and so deadly to work that it became known as the mountain that eats men. For more than 100 years, that mountain fed an unbroken flow of metal that was shipped out of the Americas. Spanish treasure fleets hauled cargo after cargo across the Atlantic, creating what looked like an unstoppable conveyor belt of wealth feeding Spain. From 1500 to 1650, Spain brought in roughly 180,000 tons of silver and 2,000 tons of gold from its American possessions. To grasp the scale, that was more silver than the entire continent of Europe had produced over the previous 1,000 years combined. This wasn't just a regional windfall. This metal altered the balance of power in Europe and transformed how the world's economy functioned. Silver from the New World didn't stay in one port. From cities like Seville and Cadiz, Spanish ships moved bullion in every direction, toward the Mediterranean, up to the Low Countries, and even across the Pacific, where it was carried to Manila. There, Spanish silver was traded directly for Chinese porcelain and silk. This was the early architecture of the first truly global economy, a web of trade linking Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia into a single network, and at the heart of it, orchestrating the flow, sat Spain. For Americans today, this creates a shock when you line up timelines. In 1607, when Jamestown was established, a fragile English outpost clinging to survival in a swamp, Spain already had functioning imperial cities. Mexico City had its own universities, active printing presses, and towering cathedrals. Lima was not an experiment. It was a sophisticated urban center. St. Augustine in Florida, founded by Spain in 1565, was the first permanent European settlement in what is now the United States, predating Jamestown by more than 40 years. The contrast is stark. While England's earliest permanent settlement in North America was still stumbling through starvation and disease, Spain had already built lasting cities, institutions, and governance in the New World. Spain wasn't just ahead in terms of discovery or conquest. It was laying down roads, ports, religious authority, administration, the physical and political infrastructure of an empire, while England and France were still losing money and men on failed colonial attempts. But despite all that, this empire, sustained by floods of bullion, was unstable at its core. The fundamental problem was that Spain mistook treasure for durable wealth. The silver and gold were real, the ships were real, the mines were real. But how that money was used turned a towering advantage into a weakness. Prices inside Spain exploded. Between the year 1500 and 1600, inflation surged so badly that prices for everyday goods quadrupled over the course of a single century. People living in Spain found that basic necessities, bread, clothes, were getting harder and harder to afford, even while their country was supposed to be sitting on bottomless riches. The reason is simple. Money only holds its value when it is scarce and trusted. When an economy is suddenly flooded with metal, but the actual number of goods being produced doesn't rise alongside it, each coin buys less. Imagine a town where a loaf of bread costs 1 coin. Then imagine 10 times more coins suddenly entering the town, but no new bakers appear, and no new fields are planted. The number of loaves hasn't changed, but everyone has more coins. The bakers see that and raise their prices. Bread now costs 2, then 3, then 4 coins. Not because the bread improved, but because the coins are losing their power. That is what happened to Spain. Historians and economists refer to this as the price revolution, the first massive wave of global inflation in European history, triggered by a flood of silver chasing a limited supply of goods. But inflation didn't land on everyone the same way. The people closest to the silver, nobles, high-ranking merchants, major financiers, were the first to handle the new money. They could buy assets and pay off debts with strong coins before prices rose. They were ahead of the curve. Wages, on the other hand, did not climb nearly as fast as prices. Most ordinary Spaniards survived on fixed or slow-moving incomes. So, while the elite could initially benefit from the flow of metal, the lower and middle ranks of society watched their purchasing power evaporate. The outcome was cruel. The more treasure Spain brought home, the less secure life felt for its own people. What should have been an economic miracle became a kind of toxin. Silver that looked like salvation in the short term quietly hollowed out the economy in the long term. And the errors didn't stop at inflation. Spain made another fatal mistake. Instead of using its treasure to develop productive industries at home, it used its money to buy from everyone else. Merchants from Italy, traders from the Low Countries, German metal workers, and other foreign suppliers got rich selling arms, ships, textiles, tools, and luxury goods to Spain, which paid with American silver. Instead of building a strong domestic manufacturing base or nurturing self-sustaining trade networks, Spain drifted into the habit of importing what it needed. Why bother nurturing competitive industries, training artisans, or building efficient trade companies when the treasure fleets could cover the bills? Spain trained itself to act like a buyer, not a builder. Meanwhile, its rivals, especially those who intercepted, traded for, or stole pieces of that same silver, reinvested what they captured. They put money into fleets, banking systems, and commercial expansion. Spain had an economy that looked rich because of inflows, but internally it was getting weaker, even as its competitors quietly built systems that would outlast it. There was another drain, too. Spain's rulers poured unbelievable sums into warfare. The Habsburg monarchy believed it had a divine responsibility to defend Catholicism after the Protestant Reformation, and that sense of destiny came with an enormous bill. Treasure from the Americas was spent financing armies against the Ottoman Turks, suppressing the Dutch revolt, and intervening in the French wars of religion. Spain also committed itself to the 30 Years' War, one of the most destructive conflicts in European history, a continent-spanning fight between Catholic and Protestant powers. Even the famous Spanish Armada of 1588, the massive fleet Spain sent to invade and punish Protestant England, was bankrolled by New World silver. And when that armada failed, the financial shock to Spain was immediate and severe. So, the natural question is, with all the gold and silver flowing in, where did the money actually end up? The answer is that it vanished into ships, soldiers, fortresses, interest payments, and promises. Spain wasn't only spending the treasure that arrived in port. The crown was borrowing against the treasure that hadn't even left the Americas yet. German banking dynasties like the Fuggers, followed later by powerful Genoese financiers, fronted Spain enormous loans backed by future shipments of silver. On paper, this looked like a sophisticated system. The mines of Potosi, along with others in Mexico and Peru, would keep producing metal indefinitely. The fleets would keep sailing. The loans could be repaid once the next convoy reached Seville. In reality, it was a trap. If a treasure fleet was delayed, destroyed in a storm, or intercepted at sea, Spain's entire financial structure buckled. When incoming silver failed to arrive on time, the crown couldn't pay its creditors. And so, throughout the 16th century, Spain declared bankruptcy over and over again. 1557, 1575, 1596, and 1607 all saw the empire default. Think about that. The most powerful empire on Earth, controlling territory across oceans and extracting more precious metal than anyone in recorded history, was still collapsing into default roughly every 20 years. That was the scale of the problem, and into this already unstable machine sailed the pirates. These were not just lone raiders chasing random loot. They were tools of strategy. England and the Netherlands recognized a brutal financial truth. If you strike at Spain's treasure convoys, you don't just grab silver, you blow a hole in Spain's credit. Francis Drake, acting with the approval of Queen Elizabeth, circled the globe in the 1580s, seizing Spanish treasure, and came home with wealth equal to about half of England's yearly revenue. Piet Hein, a Dutch privateer, captured an entire Spanish treasure fleet near Cuba in 1628, a haul valued at 11 million guilders. That single hit nearly wrecked Spain's finances again. Every time a treasure fleet went down, it wasn't just a maritime loss. It was an instant system-wide shock. Spain had already spent or pledged much of that silver before it even arrived. When storms, privateers, or naval ambushes cut off those shipments, bankers across Europe were suddenly left unpaid. Meanwhile, England and the Netherlands plowed their stolen silver into naval expansion, banking innovation, and global trade companies. The same silver that Spain treated as a lifeline was being used by its rivals to build the foundations of their future dominance. Spain's lifeline had become the weak point that others targeted again and again. Spain's monarchs could have chosen another path. They could have channeled the flood of bullion into a long-term economic base inside Spain itself. They might have invested heavily in domestic production, encouraged technological and commercial innovation, or built a stable and broad tax system that captured wealth from across the whole population, rather than relying almost entirely on silver inflows. But that didn't happen. Instead, the monarchy behaved as though the silver would never run out. The crown fell into a lethal dependence on debt tied to future shipments. Starting in the mid-1500s, Spanish rulers borrowed aggressively against treasure that hadn't even made it across the ocean yet. Banking houses in places like Germany and Genoa offered massive lines of credit in exchange for guaranteed slices of upcoming convoys. The rhythm was always the same. Bullion would arrive in Seville, debts would be paid down, and then the cycle would restart. But the design had a built-in flaw. If the treasure was late, or captured, or sunk, there was nothing to repay with. And when that happened, Spain defaulted, not once, but repeatedly. From 1557 to 1607, the empire had to admit insolvency 4 separate times. Imagine a ruler sitting on more silver than any kingdom had ever seen, and still being forced again and again to inform creditors, "We cannot pay." War made the situation worse. Spain's Habsburg kings weren't just political leaders. They saw themselves as guardians of Catholic order after the Reformation, and defending that identity drained staggering amounts of cash. Silver from the Americas funded operations against the Ottoman Empire, brutal campaigns to crush the Dutch revolt, and efforts to fight Protestant England. The 1588 Armada alone cost millions of ducats, the modern equivalent of billions. And when it failed to conquer England, the blow wasn't only military. It sent shockwaves through Spain's finances. And still, the machine kept burning through money. The 30 Years' War, which ravaged Europe between 1618 and 1648, consumed Spanish wealth at a terrifying rate. And through all of this, one pattern held: most of the money didn't actually stay in Spain. The silver rushed in, only to surge back out. Italian shipyards were paid, Flemish merchants were paid, German lenders were paid. Foreign artisans and suppliers, often in regions that would later become Spain's rivals, benefited directly from Spain's spending. Spain became a consumer of other people's production. Every new fleet that docked in Seville effectively enriched outsiders while leaving Spain more hollow. By relying on imports and on borrowing from foreign bankers, the crown weakened its own internal economy and locked itself into a cycle of dependence it couldn't escape. Then there was the constant threat stalking Spain's Atlantic lifelines. The treasure fleets, convoys sailing from ports like Veracruz or through Havana, bound for Spain, were not just shipments. They were paychecks for the empire. They carried the money that Spain had already promised to lenders, soldiers, and suppliers. That meant that each fleet was a single point of failure. Losing even one wasn't just painful. It was catastrophic. In 1628, Dutch privateer Piet Hein did exactly that. He intercepted an entire Spanish treasure fleet off the coast of Cuba and seized cargo worth more than 11 million guilders. That one raid smashed confidence in Spain's ability to keep paying what it owed. English figures like Francis Drake and John Hawkins, backed by the English crown, took the same approach. piracy as national policy, aimed directly at weakening Spain. Every captured galleon was more than plunder. It was a calculated strike on Spain's financial heartbeat. England and the Netherlands didn't just spend what they grabbed. They reinvested it in the things Spain should have been building: navies, banks, and trading companies. Spain, which relied on treasure arriving safely, had built an empire that was uniquely fragile. Other emerging powers, especially England and the Dutch Republic, were diversifying. They were building strength through agriculture, long-distance trade, and eventually the early forms of industry. Spain, in contrast, bet almost everything on bullion. When a fleet made it home, debts could be paid, and the system limped forward. When a fleet vanished, everything lurched toward crisis and default again. Pirates were not just stealing gold and silver. They were chipping away at the structural supports of Spain's global position. By the early 1600s, Spain still looked unbeatable on a map. Its flag flew in Europe, across huge portions of the Americas, across the seas, and into Asia. Its kings lived in splendor, its palaces were lined with luxury, and its churches were filled with treasures hauled out of the New World. But under that surface, the empire was financially exhausted. Inflation had eaten away at basic stability inside Spain. Endless borrowing had chained the monarchy to foreign lenders. Piracy and naval raids had turned the empire's most important supply line into a constant liability. For ordinary people in Spain, the supposed wealth of the empire was mostly an illusion. Prices kept rising, wages lagged behind, taxes climbed to pay for campaigns that seemed to have no end. The empire that claimed to be the richest on earth was, in practice, draining itself to stay afloat. As Spain staggered under the cost of its own treasure, other powers were watching and learning. The English, the Dutch, and eventually the French understood what Spain either couldn't see or refused to act on. Silver alone does not build an empire that lasts. Spain's imperial model in the Americas was extractive. Colonies existed to pull resources outward, forced labor in mines, tributes sent back to Europe, treasure fleets loaded and dispatched, not to create balanced, growing local economies. It was a system designed for plunder. Britain took a different route. Its North American colonies didn't sit on mountains of gold or silver, but they produced things with continuous value: tobacco, sugar, timber, and, later on, cotton. Those commodities fed manufacturing, trade, and finance. Instead of relying entirely on state-controlled treasure fleets, Britain built chartered companies, like the East India Company, and developed financial institutions in London. Dutch merchants did something similar. They built the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, created highly sophisticated systems of credit and trade, and turned their navy into a tool for commercial expansion. These rivals didn't sit around waiting for treasure to be dug out of the ground. They constructed systems that generated wealth on their own, and whenever they managed to intercept Spanish silver, through piracy, through war, through trade, they redirected that money into those systems. The result was compounding power for them, while Spain continued to weaken from within. This is the key difference. Spain defined wealth as possession of treasure. Britain and the Dutch Republic defined wealth as the ability to build and sustain systems that kept creating value. One is finite, the other can keep scaling, and history shows which strategy held up. By the middle of the 1600s, Spain's decline could no longer be denied. The once feared Armada, which had been a symbol of Spanish naval dominance, was reduced and weakened. Inflation, constant defaults, and repeated financial crises had damaged faith in the Spanish crown. The 30 Years' War had drained its resources. The Dutch revolt succeeded in shaking off Spanish control and produced an independent Dutch Republic that went on to become a commercial powerhouse. England's navy was expanding, its financial networks were becoming more advanced, and London was rising in influence. Spain still possessed enormous territories in name, but it no longer had the same economic force to properly defend, supply, or develop those holdings. The empire that terrified Europe in the 1500s had, by the 1700s, become a fading giant. But Spain's fall is not only about monarchs, mines, naval battles, and treaties. It's about the danger built into the illusion of easy wealth. When a society is flooded with money, whether the source is treasure from conquered lands, massive new credit, or, in modern times, rapid monetary expansion, the first instinct is almost always to spend it, to leverage it. to borrow even more on the assumption that the flow will continue. That is what Spain did. And without discipline, without using that money to build real productive capacity, that inflow starts to rot the system from the inside. Spain's peasants saw it in real time. They watched galleons arrive in Seville, stacked with bullion from across the ocean. And yet, they themselves struggled to buy bread because prices had shot out of reach. Today, people who save money and work for wages see something similar when inflation eats away at their purchasing power, while political leaders insist that the broader economy is strong. The details are different, but the pressure feels familiar. The pirate attacks of the 1600s have a modern parallel as well. Spain's treasure fleets created single points of failure, gigantic shipments that concentrated the empire's wealth in a few convoys. Those convoys were obvious targets. When one of them went down, Spain's finances were thrown into crisis because huge chunks of the empire's ability to pay its debts were tied to those specific ships. Today, wealth is often concentrated in other kinds of fragile structures. Giant financial institutions, enormous banks considered too big to fail, debt markets that rely completely on confidence not evaporating. When one of those pillars cracks, the ripple effect is immediate. A single collapse can threaten the stability of the entire system. Spain's disaster in 1628, when Piet Hein captured an entire treasure fleet off Cuba and seized silver worth more than 11 million guilders, worked the same way. One strike exposed the fragility of Spain's whole financial model. It wasn't just a theft. It was proof that the empire's foundations could be shaken by one catastrophe. The warning is harsh but unavoidable. Treasure is not the same thing as wealth. Silver is not the same thing as safety. Real lasting wealth comes from building systems that keep creating value over time, from investing in production, from strengthening institutions, from developing an economy that can survive shocks. Spain had the greatest flow of precious metal the world had ever seen, and still bankrupted itself, because it believed that owning half the world and draining its mines meant lasting security. What it actually created was vulnerability. The rivals who understood the deeper rules, England, the Dutch, later France, were the ones who built the future on top of Spain's failures. History doesn't literally repeat step for step, but its rhythm is hard to miss. The wealthiest empire of its age collapsed because it mistook treasure for true prosperity. Any society that follows the same pattern, flooding itself with money while letting its foundations erode, is walking down the same road. The issue isn't whether the pattern exists. The only real question is whether we're willing to see the warning in time. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.